What we've got tonight is a debate between the Socialist Party of Great Britain and the Socialist Workers' Party on the question of, after the miners' strike, which way forward for Socialists. The format of the evening will be, firstly, Steve Coleman of the Socialist Party will speak for 25 minutes. That will be followed by Colin Tipton of the Socialist Workers' Party for 25 minutes. We'll have a brief interval where you can sort of get a drink, etc., come back in. Then we'll throw it over to questions and discussion, which is probably the most important part of the meeting. So we hope that you'll push the speakers to explain their points further at that stage. Right, I think without more ado, I'll call on Steve Coleman.
Thank you, Comrade Chairman, comrades and friends. Nearly 100 years ago, in 1887, there was a major miners' strike in Britain. It was the biggest of the miners' strikes that took place at the end of the last century during the crisis. The whole of Lanarkshire came out, Scottish minefields were put to a stop, Northumberland came out, the northeast of England was facing its biggest industrial crisis ever. And it was to be a long struggle, it was a bitter strike against the parasites who owned the mines in the northeast of England and in Scotland. And as usual, when there's a strike, there was no shortage of pious support and radical sloganising offered to the workers by those who thought that capitalism ought to be made fair. People who thought that the miners deserved a fair wage, people who thought that the miners would have their grievances remedied if only the mines were nationalised and put in the hands of the state, people who wanted to bring a bit of fairness into the capitalist world, all assembled around this great strike and did their best to support it. And in April of that year, 1887, William Morris went up to Newcastle to address the striking miners, and William Morris was a speaker for the Socialist League, and he was a revolutionary. They'd never had anything like it in the whole of the northeast of England, in all of the rallies during the miners' strike of 1887, because William Morris was not prepared to gas the ritualistic slogans about "we're behind you, brothers," and "you can win within capitalism." William Morris told the miners what every revolutionary always says in every strike situation: the wages system cannot be made fair. You cannot humanise capitalism. You cannot have any real and lasting victory as long as you are being robbed by the wages system, which is bound at all times to leave you without dignity, without fairness, without happiness. And I want to quote from the speech that William Morris made in front of 2,000 miners at that rally in Newcastle in 1887, because I want to show you it's happened before. History has repeated itself. It was reported in the Newcastle Chronicle on the 11th of April 1887, and if any of you have a chance to read it in full, it was a magnificent speech. William Morris said, "Their struggle was for a position in which they would be able to live a life which people called tolerable. He did not call the life of a working man under the present system a tolerable life at all. When they had gained all that was possible under the present system, they would still not have the life that human beings ought to have. What was their life at the best? They worked hard, day in, day out, without any sort of hope whatever. Their work was to work to live in order that they might live to work." Now, Morris was saying there precisely what socialists must always do. He looked beyond the immediate struggle for the crumbs within capitalism, which are created by the working class who create the whole of the cake. He looked beyond it and he said the real struggle has to be not for the right to be employed, not for the right to have security as a wage slave, but for the freedom to live creatively, to work in a society that you own and control. Now, Morris put the case then that I put tonight for the abolition of the wages system. Now, I've been told in the past by so-called socialists who I've met, and you meet so-called socialists in all kinds of places, and we argue with one another rather like a scene out of the life of Brian about which one is the real socialist and which one is really on the right road and who got the dots and the commas in Marx right. But they say, look, you can't go around the working class advocating the abolition of the wages system. I mean, you go and tell them that on a picket line or at a strike committee meeting that what you really ought to be doing is fighting to get rid of the whole system that makes you a wage slave. You'll be laughed at. People will say you're mad. And this, of course, is the view of the Socialist Workers' Party. You don't go around talking to workers about ending wage slavery, because if you do, people will think you're mad. And this, indeed, is why the SWP is a political party which is eminently sane. It is one of the most sane political parties which has ever had the audacity to call itself revolutionary. It's so sane that when it goes along to a picket line or to a strike meeting, it parrots all of the demands that workers are making. It says, you want higher wages? Well, that is what you've got to concentrate on. You want to end pit closures? That's a victory we've got to go for. We demand that there shall be no pit closures. That was the slogan which the SWP had on its banners throughout the 84-85 miners' strike. They come along and say, you want the right to get a job, to be exploited, to be a wage slave? That's what we'll do. And on their banners in the 70s, the Socialist Workers' Party said, demand the right to work, demand the right to become a wage slave, to be exploited by someone else. And like in 1887, in 1985, the miners' strike ended in defeat, because the system was greater, as it always is greater, than the sentiments and the demands which challenge it. As long as those sentiments and those demands are entrenched within the rut of capitalism. And this is what always happens in a capitalist system. You cannot expect capitalists whose function in society is to legally rob the working class for profit to say, we'll ignore the dictatorship of profit and will bow to the requirements of human needs. So, let me make it clear at the outset that the future does not lie in the direction of what appears to be sane and reasonable and realistic. People who think that that's where the future lies, people who think that you have to tag on to the prejudices and to the apparent, inevitable realities of capitalism in order to build a movement to transform society. They are, in fact, the people who are buried in the past. If you're a socialist, you have to put forward ideas which may, perhaps immediately, meet with the questioning and the doubt of workers who you meet. And if it means that as a revolutionary, people occasionally turn round to you, as they often do to me, and say you're stark raving mad, then you should be checking your socialist credentials when workers never say that to you. Because when workers stop telling you that you're a little bit mad, when workers persist in telling you that you are in fact accepting the same kind of ideas that capitalism has conditioned them to want, then you're not, of course, offering something new. You're tagging on to the past. Now, I want to make three basic criticisms of my opponent's party, and in so doing, I want to defend the position of the Socialist Party. I'm not criticising my opponent because he's not a good enough socialist or because he's not a concerned enough revolutionary. I wouldn't waste my time doing that. I'm opposing him and his party because I would argue that they are not socialists and that they are not revolutionaries. And we have to look logically and clearly at the evidence for that claim. The first criticism which I put to my opponent is that his party spreads illusions about what can be done within capitalism. Let's be clear. Under capitalism, goods and services are produced for sale on the market with a view to profit. They're not produced for use. They're not produced so that human requirements can be satisfied. They are produced primarily for profit, and if there's no profit, then there is no production. And that's why, as millions of people starve, they're surrounded by rotting food. As tens of thousands die of the cold every winter, coal mines have to be shut because it's not profitable to keep them open. That is the economic law of capitalism, and it is an unavoidable economic law within capitalism. But my opponent's party is repeatedly demanding of the capitalists that they ignore the iron law of profit. At the moment, there are something like 4 million unemployed workers in Britain, millions more across the world. These are useful people who want to work. They want to produce useful things. But the capitalist class, quite rightly, in accordance with their class interests, say, we are not going to employ you. There's no profit in you. We're not going to exploit you. Again, when the British state says that we're going to decimate the coal mining industry, there's not enough profit in it, why should capitalists have to subsidise it to keep it going? That is perfectly right and logical and rational within the terms of the law of the capitalist system. And it is folly in the extreme to demand of the capitalists that they continue being the master class in capitalism, but they allow profits to bow to needs. And that is why last October, when Margaret Thatcher was being interviewed on BBC Radio by one of her fellow members of the Tory intelligentsia, Jimmy Young, she said, and I quote, "Uneconomic pits have always had to be closed, have always been closed, and must always be closed." And indeed, after a year of struggle, she demonstrated, as a Labour government would have demonstrated, as any government of capitalism will demonstrate, that that is precisely what the economic law of profit says. Now, there are two reasons why the Socialist Workers' Party may advocate these tactics for trying to deal with the problems of capitalism which expect the law of profit to be ignored. One of them is that quite possibly they simply don't understand capitalism. Like the Bishop of Durham, they're sort of compelled by a mixture of naive goodwill and utter economic ignorance. And therefore, they look at the system and they say, this is the way it should be, this is what we expect of capitalism, therefore why isn't it happening that way? And without doubt that explains why many people on the left wing of capitalism are putting forward utopian demands for the system, demands which are ultimately condemned to the dustbins of the stock exchange, which is where the power really matters. But the second and more pernicious reason that the Socialist Workers' Party adopts this futile tactic of telling workers to demand the impossible within capitalism is that it is argued that by showing workers what cannot be achieved, by telling workers to devote their energies and their passions towards aims which cannot be realised, workers are going to find out. It's like putting a group of school kids on the edge of a cliff, leaving them there to play, and when they come out of the intensive care unit, you say, well, there you are. You've learnt the lesson the hard way. Now we're going to play ice skating on the motorway, and you'll learn that lesson as well. And this is the repeated argument that's put forward by those who think that they can lead people into an education of their class position by telling them to do what can't be done. The thousands of workers who marched along behind the so-called Right to Work campaign, who thought that they were demanding and were going to get, if there was enough energy and passion, the opportunity to do useful work. The total failure of that campaign hasn't led them into learning the lessons. It's led thousands of them into bitter disillusion and into a feeling of cynicism towards politics and towards those who call themselves socialists. So let's be clear that the way forward for socialists has to begin with an understanding of what the capitalist system is, and an honesty, and sometimes it's a very painful honesty, about what can and what cannot be achieved within it. And therefore, you say to workers that you've got a simple choice. Either you persist in attempting to run the wages system in the interest of wage slaves, either you try to organise the slaughterhouse in the interest of the cattle, or alternatively, you dismiss this whole project and you organise consciously for the socialist alternative. But this brings me to the next criticism I have to make of my opponent's party, that one searches in vain to find out what they mean by socialism, what socialism actually means in the vocabulary of the Socialist Workers' Party. They argue, quite correctly, I would have no disagreement, that Russia and its empire is not socialist. They can't be faulted on that at all. They argue China isn't socialist, Cuba isn't socialist, Albania isn't socialist. One can have no disagreement with that, even if I find it absurd in the extreme that the position of the Socialist Workers' Party is that Russia was socialist up until 1929, and then it performed the greatest ever leap back through social evolution known in history. It was socialist, and then it turned capitalist again. We're all sitting in capitalism waiting for socialism, but apparently the Russian workers went to bed in 1928, they got up on New Year's morning, looked around, they said, well, blow me, Ivan, capitalism's come. What nonsense. And according to Tony Cliff, it's all because Stalin was in charge instead of Trotsky. But for a party which has so much to say about socialism, it's quite mystifying that you read through many copies of Socialist Worker. I've done this. And they never tell you what this socialism is that we should be arguing for. For example, in Socialist Worker, there's a column called Where We Stand. Now you would think, well, that's a column to turn to. Read it. I doubt whether half the SWPers here have read it. Read the column called Where We Stand. What does it tell you about socialism? Does it explain in any way the basic differences between capitalism and socialism? Does it say that in a socialist society the means of living, the factories, the mines, the farms, the offices, the media, will be the common ownership of all people, not of a state or of individual capitalists? Does it explain that socialism will be a democratic world community where there will be no state and a group of people who, not being part of the government, are the governed and oppressed, no leaders or led? Does it explain that socialism is a society where everything will of necessity be available on the basis of free access to wealth? Because where you have common ownership, where the wealth of the world is owned in common, then everyone has free access to everything in a moneyless society. I see the SWP at the bookstall's embarrassed by this. This is an education class as well as a debate. Does it explain in Socialist Worker that it will be a society in which labour will be voluntary and cooperative on the basis of the principle from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs? That it will be a wageless society? Not a word about it. You can read copy after copy of Socialist Worker. Not a word about a moneyless society. Not a word about a wageless society. Not a word about a stateless society. You just don't find it. Look at the literature. Attend the meetings of the Socialist Party. See what we have to say. Look at the clear socialist alternative we present. I put it to my opponent. I defy him when he stands up. Present us with a single statement in the literature of what is meant to be a socialist party, which tells us about socialism. But this debate is about the way forward for socialists. And if you're a socialist, what is the way forward? The way forward is to socialism. You've got to know what it is in order to be able to pursue the discussion about direction. If I tell my opponent, for example, that we're in Guildford at the moment and I want to get to Glasgow, it's not going to be any good for me to say, well, the way we'll do it is that I'll take a trip up to Aberdeen, and then I'll go to Edinburgh, and then I'll go to Dundee, and maybe eventually, when I've tried all of the wrong roads, when experience has taught me the lessons of my folly, I may perhaps end up in Glasgow. It's not the way to do it. The Socialist Workers' Party says to workers, vote for the Labour Party. I have in front of me the latest issue of Socialist Worker, a magnificent document, an exemplary statement of crass stupidity in a letter to the militant tendency where it says, our attitude is clear. We are for a Labour government. It goes on. We believe a future Labour government will not act in the interest of the working class. On the contrary, it will act like every previous Labour government in the interest of the bosses class. I repeat the first sentence. Our attitude is clear. It's clearly absurd to advocate that people vote for a government that is against their class interest. But of course, you have to remember the tactic, and the tactic is that you've got to let workers go down every wrong avenue before they discover the wisdom of following the Socialist Workers' Party as a vanguard. Now, I'll tell you what socialists have to argue in relation to the socialist alternative. We have to go to workers when there's a strike, as we do. We have to go to workers when they're in the street or the pubs or workplaces or wherever, and we have to say, this is the clear alternative that can remedy the problems that face you now. This is precisely how a society of production solely for use will eradicate the problems of a society of production for sale and profit. This is how we can do it. This is how we can build houses for people to live in. This is how we can organise the workplace without wage slavery. This is how we can operate society without the fetter and the waste of the monetary system. That's what we have to do. Now, the Socialist Workers' Party is a leadership party. It is a vanguard. It is a group of nouveau Bolsheviks, latter-day Leninists. They're proud of the fact their entire principles are the principles of Leninism. And if you look at the Leninist revolutionary scenario, it's a very simple one. The workers follow the vanguard to socialism. Why do the workers follow the vanguard? Very simple. Because according to Lenin, embodied in the whole principle of Leninism, which my opponent must defend, workers cannot on their own understand the case for socialism. This is the position of Lenin. I quote from what he said in 1918 at the Peasant Soviet Congress in Russia. He said, if socialism can only be realised when the intellectual development of the people permits it, then we shall not see socialism for at least 500 years. The Socialist political party, which is the vanguard of the working class, must not allow itself to be halted by the lack of education of the mass average, but must lead the masses. Now, I don't know whether this is the view of my opponent, but it's a view of his party. It's the basic argument of Leninism in relation to social transformation. The way you change society is based fundamentally upon the assumption that the majority of workers cannot think out the solution for themselves, but must be led into this. This was a position stated more than explicitly by Lenin in What Is to Be Done. Now, we in the Socialist Party argue very clearly that socialism will not be established unless socialists establish it. Socialists will not establish it unless a majority of workers understand and want it. And we argue that a majority of workers can understand. That if we can understand, they can understand. If we can desire production for use as an alternative, they can see the benefits as well. Unlike the Socialist Workers' Party, we don't hold with the quite unhistorical and outdated idea that revolution has to be by an enlightened and conscious minority leading an unconscious majority. But if you look in the literature of the Socialist Workers' Party, you find precisely that argument, completely contrary to the position put forward by Marx and by the First International in 1864, that the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. That was Marx's position. And we don't accept it because it was Marx's position. We accept it because it is the correct position, because you cannot impose liberation. You cannot lead people into liberation. You cannot have a liberated society in which the mass of the people are followers. You can only have socialism on the basis of democracy and on the basis of mass understanding. So let me summarise the case which I've argued. Firstly, I've argued that socialists have to have an understanding of capitalism. And I have defined what capitalism is. And they have to have a clear socialist alternative that they can put to workers in their literature and at their meetings and in the workplace and wherever. And I have defined quite clearly what we see as a socialist alternative. And secondly, I stated that my opponent's party spreads illusions about what can be done within capitalism, and that these illusions are both time-wasting and they are destructive of working class hope and enthusiasm. And thirdly, I pointed out that there has been an absence of any kind of clarity from my opponent's party about what socialism really means. And I put it to you that if you understand what capitalism really means, if you understand what the wages system is doing to you, if you understand the inevitability of legalised robbery under the wages system, if you understand the inevitability of workers being trodden into the ground by the dictates of profit, then you will understand the inevitability of there being only one alternative course to capitalism. And that is the one based upon conscious, majority-based political action on a democratic basis for socialist revolution. There is no alternative. And I conclude by putting this point to my opponent because it is vitally important. I began by referring to 1887, a magnificent strike. Thousands of passionate men and women of the working class. Dedication, enthusiasm, cooperation, mass organisation all over the country. Men and women trying to fight for this aim of bringing dignity for the miners. In 1984-85, history has repeated itself at the mischievous expense of the working class. And unless the urgency is grasped of the struggle for the abolition of the wages system, unless capitalism is understood, unless the socialist alternative is put with clarity and enthusiasm, unless we can show that workers have the strength to go beyond the petty victories of the struggle for the crumbs, unless we can show that, then in 100 years' time we could still be facing the same defeats, the same wasted enthusiasm, the same energies and disillusion following their expenditure. And that is why it is not as urgent today as it was in 1887 for us to organise for socialist revolution. It is far more urgent.
Tipton will reply for the Socialist Workers' Party.
OK, I must start off by saying I thought I was debating with the Guildford Anarchist Group and not the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Certainly I think Steve Coleman's presentation was quite remarkable, not for what it said, but for what it didn't. There was mention of the miners' strike, especially in the 1880s, but very little about the effects and lessons to be learnt from the recent miners' strike in 1984 to 85. There was a hell of a lot of talk about the abolition of the wages system, but no mention of the dodgy state of working class organisations at the workplace and in the community today in Britain in 1985. No mention at all of the large numbers of people, especially young people, completely turned off by any strategy we on the left may cook up which doesn't relate to their immediate situation. No mention of the unemployed, no mention of the 500,000 plus on government training or job creation schemes, and no mention at all of the peace movement. No mention of all the political discussion, all the political activity that is currently taking place on the left in Britain. And just to put our case, socialism as we see it is not simply about abstract propagandism, merely talking about equality, merely talking about social justice, merely talking about an irreversible shift of power and wealth, culminating in what the Socialist Party of Great Britain call a society of common ownership and free access. Socialism for us is not this. It's not abstract propagandism. It's also about working people themselves, changing society, and in the process, hopefully changing our ways of thinking and ways of behaving. Surely any socialist strategy worth its salt, any socialist strategy that doesn't take as its starting point ordinary people, will flounder. And in addition, it seems to me it will fail to connect with the everyday struggles and existence that most people live, far removed from socialist discussion and socialist debate in smoke-filled rooms like this. And quite rightly, I think, the Socialist Workers' Party has always been very pleased, indeed honoured, to be tagged with the label rank and fileism. Rank and fileism because it reflects our basic line on what we call the self-activity of the working class. On socialism from below, rather than the socialism from above by Labour MPs and trade union leaders, trade union bureaucrats. We argue that different struggles, whether by dinner ladies, whether by hospital workers, whether by school kids, whether by peace campaigners, whether by miners, whether by school teachers, whether by black people, or whether by YTS trainees, should in fact be our starting point. Thus, some years ago, people may remember, we took the initiative in setting up, in forming the Anti-Nazi League, a broad-based campaign which included people who opposed racism of whatever party, and some of them were in no party at all. And similarly, despite some of the distortions that Steve has put forward, another link which the Socialist Workers' Party has been making is with the sort of thing you might have read. You might call it a bourgeois capitalist paper, fair enough, The Guardian, for April the 26th. This was the headline: "Thousands join children's strike for jobs." And I'll just read you a little extract. "Thousands of school kids walked out of their classes yesterday afternoon in protest at the government's youth training scheme. The organisers, the Youth Trade Union Rights Campaign, said that there were 200,000 strikers in 20 towns and cities up and down Britain." And that's the sort of struggles, they're the sort of things that we argue one should be connecting with. And similarly, our members were on the picket lines. They were on the picket lines during the 1972 miners' strike. They were on the picket lines during the 1984-85 miners' strike, and probably during almost every other industrial dispute that's taken place in Britain over the past 15 years. The purpose, we argue, of going to the picket lines has been to declare solidarity, to hand over collections. For example, in the recent miners' strike, the Guildford Miners Support Group raised £7,000 for the miners. To hand over collections that have been pulled together, that have been held in other places of work, and generally to give support and encouragement at times when everyone else was completely hostile to the miners. So this is the point we make, that we are very much against those who are likely to get lost in the search for the Holy Grail of electoral success, and also we're very much against, as I say, people who argue, as I think Steve has, that one should somehow stand outside these sort of struggles in a sort of purist way, playing the role of a kind of Jehovah's Witness of the left, instead of relating to these struggles, instead of seeing these struggles as stages or partial stages on the road, on the route to the development of a socialist society. So that's our argument. If these struggles are not the starting point, we're saying they're highly likely to get lost in the search for the holy grails of either electoral success or the holy grails of sort of abstract propagandism for what I call pie-in-the-sky socialism. If these struggles get lost, of course, then so does the whole socialist movement. And in addition, perhaps, we would argue the greatest insurance against sectarianism of the kind which I think, I must say, I accused Steve Coleman in his earlier presentation, the way he slagged off the Socialist Workers' Party. Yes, sectarianism. One insurance against this is the attempt to assist and encourage workers in struggle rather than, as I say, pushing these abstract propagandism without relating at all to people in struggle, people in battle against the capitalist system. So a lot of people might come up and say, OK, fair enough, what's new? What lessons of direct relevance to our present position can we learn not from the miners' strike in the 1880s, but from the recent miners' strike that finished only a few weeks ago? OK, the miners' strike is very clearly one of the failures of history. It was a strike that didn't come off. And with our eyes on the present, with our eyes As socialists on the future, why concern ourselves with the past, especially the unsuccessful past? And I think there are at least two good reasons for not adopting the viewpoint implicit in the question I've just posed. One obvious reason is that the present and the possible future cannot be understood without an understanding of the past, including the unsuccessful past. And I think it's a point often overlooked, even by intelligent historians, that there is much to be learned, that there is as much to be learned from the failures of history as from the successes of history. And an understanding of why the miners' strike failed, and a pondering, a serious reflection on the implications of that failure, can illuminate, we would argue, our understanding of the present. Of course, in 25 minutes, I haven't got time to carry out such a massive task, pulling together all the local regional pictures which the miners' strike threw up, the struggle in South Wales, the struggle in Durham, the struggle in Yorkshire, etc. But there is a book which you'll be able to buy at our bookstall at the back of the room if people are interested, a very fine book called The Great Strike, The Miners' Strike of 1984 to 85 and Its Lessons, by Alex Kalinikos and Mike Simmons. A bloody good read.
£3.90.
Well, is your stuff free?
Depending on the price. I'm not saying it should be free.
No doubt about it, then. The past year has seen, we would argue, the most important class battle in Britain since perhaps the Chartist struggles, the Chartist movement of the 1840s. And also I think the miners' strike is likely to shape the whole balance of class forces for many years to come. Since the ruling class succeeded in their aim of inflicting a huge defeat, and no doubt about it, it was a huge defeat on the miners, then they're likely to proceed with even greater confidence to attack other groups of workers. However, if the ruling class had been defeated, then the strike might well have given other sections of the working class greater confidence to fight their own battles. Well then, what are some of the lessons? The miners' strike, we would argue, daily confirmed one of the most basic ideas, namely the recognition of the leading role of the organised working class in the fight against capitalist exploitation. Well, you might think, bloody obvious. Why do we need to confirm the relevance of the old massing of arses and clashing of classes principle? In fact, very important. In recent years, a number of ex-revolutionaries and others have argued that in the 1980s, it's impossible to sustain a kind of play-it-again Marxism-Leninism. Instead, these people have put all their money on that weird bunch of third world nationalists, peasants, lumpens, blacks and women, who, they argue, have buggered up the Marxist-Leninist script, buggered it up by flooding on unannounced, or at least well ahead of cue, from backstage and the wings where Marx and Lenin confine them. In addition, some of these people, they now call themselves sociologists, not so long ago were even viewing the militant British miner as a kind of industrial dinosaur, a relic of a bygone age of class conflict who was fast on the road to extinction. Of course, the miners' strike demonstrated the complete shallowness of these ideas. Once again, we saw the British miner, as in 1972, as in the general strike of 1926, and as in Steve's example in the miners' strike of the 1880s. We saw the British miner once again challenging the rulers of an unjust and unequal society, just as the South African miner is challenging the rulers of an unequal and racist and unjust society at this very moment while we're talking in this hall. Furthermore, we think the whole struggle brought to the fore many issues which went beyond the immediate question of pit closures. Furthermore, we think the whole struggle brought to the fore many issues which went beyond the immediate question of pit closures. For example, the violence of the police on the picket lines and in the pit villages, the use of the courts, and the restrictions on the free movement of miners' pickets have exposed key sectors of the state apparatus as agents of the capitalist system. And once again, we'd argue, the daily smears in the media against the militant pickets also had a very important purpose. They served to distract attention from the arguments involved. Once it was established that the militants were consumed with a desire to kick a copper in the balls on the picket line, there was no need to proceed any more with discussion about the issues involved. It follows from this, the media would argue, that the pickets were power fanatics, exploiting genuine grievances for sinister purposes, people who were out to destroy civil liberties, and if the cliches are not running out, the entire fabric of British life. And the smears also, of course, serve to distract from any analysis, serious analysis, of the grievances involved. Remember the parable told by the American writer Saul Alinsky. When asked why he became, some years ago, Saul Alinsky was asked why he became a radical. And this is the parable. A fisherman sitting by the river leaped in to pull out a body floating downstream. And he very quickly tried to apply the kiss of life to revive the unfortunate fellow. But it happened again and again. And after a while, he ignored the umpteenth drowning man and ran upstream, exclaiming to another guy who was fishing by the river, "This time I'm going to find out who the hell is pushing these poor folks into the water." The message then was that as long as you do nothing about causes, you will go on just pulling out bodies, mopping up the casualties. And that's where our argument in the Socialist Workers' Party starts, with the need to end the grievances, with the whole politics of abolition. Put briefly, it goes like this. The crisis which seems to have come so suddenly upon us has its roots, as Steve pointed out, in the capitalist system of production in which priorities are determined by the profit motive. That is, by the provision of fortunes, by the provision of privileges and leisure for a small minority at the expense of the vast majority who produce the wealth. Our argument goes on to say massive peacetime arms expenditure after the last war served to postpone the crisis bail the capitalist system out of massive collapse. However, as countries started to cut their arms budget, particularly in the early 1960s onwards, in order to compete more effectively in the international markets, the old buffer slipped. The illusion that capitalism could expand forever to the advantage of both the robbers and the robbed was shattered. The old boom-slump cycle started to re-emerge, complicated by the oil crisis of the early 1970s. And as we know, as capitalism contracts, it unveils its unpleasant face. The welfare state is plundered and trade unions are attacked. Once again, The Guardian, May the 6th, 1985. Cuts may delay treatment for cancer patients. Cancer treatment for hundreds of people in Merseyside and North Wales may have to be postponed because health cuts are undermining the quality of nursing at one of the main radiotherapy units. Capitalism is also, of course, more powerful. More and more economic and political power is concentrated in fewer and fewer boardrooms. As we know, no one elects these boards, and they're responsible only to a handful of shareholders. Their membership is drawn from a single social class. And once again, our argument continues, the slender thread of democracy provided by parliamentary elections every 5 years can very, very easily be snapped by these economic power groups I've just mentioned, if and when an elected parliament threatens to damage their interests. And some of you may have read Harold Wilson's memoirs. You remember the guy? The white heat of science and technology and all that. And he describes in his memoirs published by Penguin, in his record of the 1964-70 Labour government, how only weeks after the Labour Party came to power, the Governor of the Bank of England got him on the blower and advised him to break all his election pledges. And Harold Wilson asked if this meant that any government would be forced to revert to full-scale Tory policies. The Governor of the Bank of England, writes Harold Wilson, quote, had to admit that that was what his argument meant because of the sheer compulsion of the economic dictation of those who exercised decisive economic power in Britain. And finally, our argument runs, there is a power, despite Steve's distortions, that is capable of harnessing the irresponsible power of the capitalist minority. And certainly it can't be mobilised on the basis of a vote every 5 years or 3 years or whatever. And that is the power of the organised working class. If workers' militancy was organised politically, we argue it could be used to transform the essentially democratic society in which we live into a truly democratic society founded on elections at the place of work. The whole idea behind workers' councils and Soviets. The whole strategy, then, consists of a minority of socialists, we would argue, relating to the fights that are taking place in the here and now in 1985 in Britain, rather than sitting back and spouting what bloody William Morris said, wonderful fellow, wonderful wallpaper designer, what William Morris said in the 1880s. Relating to fights that are taking place today in 1985 and trying to build round those struggles a revolutionary party committed to workers themselves, changing things from below. In other words, the message is mobilise, don't moralise. And finally, people might come back, Steve went on about this point and quoted a little bit from Lenin, the whole role of the Revolutionary Party. What about the role of the party? Surely we would argue this is one of the major ingredients leading to a successful revolution. The operation of a party capable of providing leadership in a revolutionary struggle for socialism. The recognition of the importance of the party implies a rejection of the belief that Steve seems to hold, a rejection of the belief that revolutionary situations will automatically or inevitably produce successful revolutions. Where revolutionary situations do occur and have occurred, we would argue that the role of the party is to attempt to win the confidence of the class as a whole by offering political leadership so that the party acts as a kind of nerve centre, as a coordinator of the revolutionary struggles bubbling up in the provinces, in the villages, in the small towns, etc. And when it judges that it has done so, the argument runs the party should take the initiative in delivering the blow that will topple the existing regime and chuck it into the dustbin of history. In the absence of the party, finally, or where the party fails to act correctly, we would argue the revolutionary energy of the masses will probably be dissipated in all kinds of localized, sporadic actions, and that the revolutionary movement is highly likely to suffer defeat. In other words, think of the analogy between revolutionary activity and surfing. Like the surfer, the revolutionary does not create the waves on which he or she rides, but balances on them. Unlike the surfer, sooner or later, the revolutionary stops riding on the waves and tries to control their direction and movement. Of course, having said all this, I must underline, I think, the fact that no revolution can take place unless the mass of the workers are convinced of its necessity. Acknowledging the damage done to the revolutionary socialist cause by its popular association with the Soviet Union, which, give him credit, Steve admitted we regarded as state capitalist, acknowledging the lack of interest anyway by the vast mass of the working class in the idea of socialism as collective self-emancipation and the creation of a society based on workers' control, acknowledging too the mental police force which operates in people's heads, we have, and also I suppose acknowledging the fact of our own small numbers, we have no illusions at all that the creation of a new revolutionary organisation like ours, based on the working class, is going to be other than a very, very hard, long slog. Yet, as the failures of successive Labour governments have shown, there are no shortcuts to socialism, no easy routes. But at the same time, finally, we would argue, without a revolution, there is the prospect of more exploitation, more racism, more violence, and more war, this time maybe a nuclear one. Still, the point is, our party, the Socialist Workers' Party, have survived so far through incredibly difficult times by trying to relate to real industrial and political pressures and the demands of real people. Remember that famous quote by Lenin, I'll just give it to you. Politics begins where the masses are, not where there are thousands, but where there are millions. That is where serious politics begins. Others, of course, have already given up by jumping into the Labour Party, or I'd argue, like the Socialist Party of Great Britain, spinning themselves a sectarian cocoon from which they can slag off other socialists who've not found their true faith. The victory of socialism has certainly been long delayed, but we would argue it's in our hands that it's not denied forever.
Right, we'll take the first question. We'll start with questions, and if people want to make contributions, we'll take those later on. So we've got a first question. Or perhaps a contribution. Question at the back.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on what the Socialist MD said about the Socialist Workers' Party supporting strikes within the capitalist system, and how this was doing supporting fairness inside the capitalist society, saying that it's unfair that they should have no wages despite within the capitalist society. That's not the Socialist Workers' Party line at all. The Socialist Workers' Party line is that we must involve ourselves in the industrial struggle in order to motivate the working class to fight against the capitalist system. So fighting against the capitalist system, they learn what the capitalist system is about. They learn that the capitalist system is directly opposed to them and is concerned merely with their exploitation. And in struggle for victory, they also learn that they also gain confidence in flexing the working class muscle. Secondly, I'd like to come back about struggles within the capitalist society we never win. As a study on, I'd like to take the minus strike to now the economy of this country is largely based on oil, not exporting oil. In order to do that, we've coal, a very, very large percentage of coal in our power stations. No production of coal, profits are cut. And that the capitalists will be balancing profits from non-production of oil against profits from cutting back the production of oil, laying off pits. So, given the mass support, given the absence of scabs, given the refusal of dockers to unload imported coal, given the reluctance of railroads to move stocks, and given mass picketing, there's no way the miners could have lost.
Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to hear your first point. You know, you say that indeed the Socialist Workers' Party doesn't simply support strikes because they want fairness in capitalism. They support strikes to demonstrate to workers that it's a whole system of exploitation you've got to oppose. That's absolutely delightful to hear, but there's no point telling me in this room, you know, it's no good sort of having one policy for the sort of private chamber and another one for when you get out on the streets. This isn't what you were saying during the miners' strike. Look at your own leaflets. During the miners' strike, what you were saying to the miners was that the victory has got to be on the basis of stopping all pit closures. What you were saying to the miners is that you can succeed. What you were saying during the Right to Work campaign is that you can have a situation where if you get full employment for workers and full exploitation for workers, workers have won the battle. There isn't any final paragraph, there isn't any footnote, there isn't any explanation which says, look, the real battle is to end the wages system, to end exploitation. And of course, my opponent in this debate has made it quite clear why that is. That is, you know, the new vogue term for it. That would be abstract propagandism. Incidentally, abstract propagandism is another word for saying what you bloody mean. What you do is, in other words, you go along and say, we stand for socialism. Well, this is abstract propagandism, my friend. We don't go in for this abstract propagandism. We go along and spin a yarn. We go along and say to the working class, we're behind you, we'll hold your coats, you go in there, we know you're going to fail. And of course, the fact of the matter is that when you say that this leads to greater confidence for workers, I mean, you know, I don't know whether you have looked at the history of the last few years. I understand the Socialist Workers' Party aren't too keen on talking about the 1880s, they prefer talking about the 1980s. Well, all right, let's take a look at it. What's happened as a result of the miners' strike? Only somebody who hasn't looked at the results of that strike in the mining areas would be unaware of the fact that thousands and thousands of miners, particularly some of the miners who were involved in the 72 and 74 strikes, have turned their back on politics. They've turned their back on what they saw as the militant struggle. They've turned their back on what they see as the socialist advice that they got because they were defeated. So don't assume that every strike brings about confidence. If you urge workers to strike for what cannot be achieved, what you create is the basis for a profound loss of confidence. And this you must understand if you want to be responsible about the kind of advice you issue. And I didn't say that workers in trade unions can never win. What I said is that workers within the wages system can never win a lasting and satisfactory victory. And I think that if we want to look at what is being said, that's quite correct. Workers cannot win lasting and satisfactory victories as long as they end up, at the end of a strike, being wage slaves, legally robbed to make somebody else a profit. And of course, what you said towards the end of your comments is quite right. It's possible at times that workers can win within capitalism. But the only basis upon which workers ever win within capitalism is if they can persuade the capitalist class, who own and control the means of wealth production and distribution, that it is in line with the capitalist agenda, that it is related to the needs of the market, that they should be allowed to win. The market simply cannot allow workers to throw aside the iron law of profit. And what you must understand is it's not simply a question of the capitalist class saying, no, we don't want the miners to win. It's not simply a case of the capitalist class having to be persuaded. It is in the nature of the capitalist system that workers will be robbed. The industries that aren't making a profit will be closed down. That workers who are recalcitrant to the point of interfering with the requirements of the market will be trodden into conformity or outcast from the labour process. And I'm very sorry that my opponent didn't address himself to that fundamental criticism, that the party which he is speaking on behalf of doesn't seem to understand that it is capitalism as a system that creates these problems, and therefore that you cannot go to workers within capitalism and tell them that they're going to win without pointing out that you cannot get rid of the effects of a disease without eradicating the disease itself. Now, if that is abstract propagandism, it is also political honesty. It's political dishonesty to go out to your fellow workers and to accept prejudices and futile hopes and false enthusiasm on the basis that by patting people on the back in a sort of patronising manner, you can say to them, you follow us and we'll give you a lead. You lead them nowhere but into failure and disillusion.
Yes, I'd like to pick up really on that point and ask a friend from the Socialist Workers' Party this point. He says that in order to connect with issues that members of the working class are involved in, you have to, rather like the surfer on the waves, be involved in the issues that they're involved in at the time, and that way, by relating to their experience, what you say to them is likely to be more, it's likely to impinge more on what they're doing than if you start to use what we describe as abstract propaganda. But I'd like to focus on one of the examples that you gave, which was that the thousands of school children who went out on strike, as it were, for jobs. And that's an area that I know a bit about. It's my line of work. It illustrates a deficiency, to my way of looking at it, of the Socialist Workers' Party case, in the sense that what you're saying to them is striking for jobs is worth the effort. Now, the socialist analysis, if that word has got any meaning at all, must surely be that jobs, by which you mean presumably employment, wage slavery, exploitation, is not what people should be striving to gain. It's not what socialists ask people to go for. Now, as soon as you start to promote, is it not right? The idea in the minds of young people that what they should be after are improved youth training schemes, improved prospects of employment. You can't. It's an irreconcilable couple of points to say on the one hand you should strive for jobs, on the one hand you should seek to establish a social system in which there will be no system of master and servant of employment. Those two things are mutually exclusive. So, especially to the young mind, it can become, you're dealing in something which is, very, very precarious. If you start to say to someone who is at a very impressionable age, you should get jobs, but really that's not what we want at all. We want the opposite of jobs. They'd be quite justified in turning around and saying, what the hell do you want? You either want them or you don't. And I'd like to hear your response on that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, what those kids were striking against, was the abolition of the YTS scheme. It was leading to wage slavery, the very things you've been talking about, and exploitation. And also, it seems to me, there are levels of consciousness. You're not going to convince the kid with the whole package. You're not going to say, oh, well, don't come out on strike, which can be seen as a blow against the system, as a blow against Thatcherism. You're not just going to go up to him and say, abolish the bloody wages system. OK, we agree in abolishing the wages system. But you've got to make the bloody revolution first. You've got to have strategy and tactics. Anyone can go around with a lot of hot air about abolishing the wages system. We believe in the stateless society.
Why don't you say so?
We do say so, despite what Steve has said. OK, I haven't got the full set of pamphlets. The boys may well have it at the back on the table. Of course we want a stateless society, but how do you get there? There are stages of development. You don't suddenly abolish the wages system overnight. How do you do it?
Something on my chair, which I read the recent...
Well, I don't know what was on your bloody chair.
Well, it's a political statement issued by your party. Now, I think it's reasonable, it's reasonable for me to say that if you...
Oh, yes, I'm trying to agree.
I've read the latest
I'm trying to answer it.
Yeah, I've read the latest issue of your paper. What I'm saying is that nowhere in the literature which you put towards people to say, look, we're the Socialist Workers' Party, follow us, vote for us. You don't say vote for us, you say vote for the Labour Party, but follow our ideas. What you're saying is that somewhere hidden, mysteriously, in between the lines, I'll ask you to locate that particular point.
Yes, but the point is, there's a whole debate. Rosa Luxemburg was very strong on this years ago about the whole relationship between reform and revolution. You seem to be implying in the question that you've asked that you sell the total package to these school kids.
To everyone, yeah.
OK, we do as a long-term goal. But in the short term, you've got to smash the system. What is the strategy you use? You're faced with a modern industrial society with a highly centralised government. A government that's got a monopoly of physical force. How do you neutralise the army? How do you neutralise the police force in order to abolish the wages system? These are concrete questions that revolutionaries like Lenin, that revolutionaries like Mao Zedong, that revolutionaries like Fidel Castro, OK, we might argue, as Steve argued quite wrongly, got the date wrong, that somehow the Russian Revolution, we wrote it off after 1929. There's been a whole debate in the Socialist Workers' Party, and before that in the International Socialists, and before that in the Socialist Review Group, a whole debate about when the Russian Revolution, in fact, totally degenerated and moved into the stage of state capitalism. Some people have dated it 1919, some people have dated it 1921, and I've never heard anyone date it beyond 1923, beyond Lenin's death.
Right.
OK.
I do just want to say one thing. I think yours should be coming in, but I have to say one thing. I've been, accused of distortion, I think, one time too many. First of all, I've got the material here, written by Pete Binns and Duncan Hallis, two members of the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party.
That's obviously a misprint.
Oh, well, it's a misprint, is it? Well, it's a bloody frequent misprint, my friend. No, actually, I think the trouble is... Well, wait. I'm not going to argue about that. I expect my opponent to know more about the Socialist Workers' Party than I do, but I suspect I know more about it on this fact, because I think he's wrong. But I'm not going to get into that. I don't care when they think it stopped being socialist. It never was bloody socialist, and the fact that they ever think it was is an indictment of their misunderstanding. But I do simply put 2 points. First of all, look, there are 2 very simple points that my opponent has made, and I want him to actually clarify them during the course of this debate. I think it will be helpful to everyone. One is, he says he hasn't got the full set of pamphlets, But he's pretty sure that, in one of them, somewhere at the back, they'll tell us exactly what the Socialist Workers' Party means by socialism. Well, look, I've actually endeavoured to find out what the Socialist Workers' Party stands for. One of the reasons I do it is the same reason as people have come to this debate. I would join it if I thought it was right. If I thought it was going to lead to socialism, I'd be in it. I'm not a sectarian. I'm not interested in defending one party against another party. I want socialism. And therefore, I put it to him, where is this secret Socialist Workers' Party pamphlet that says what they mean by socialism? I've looked everywhere. I could get a bloody PhD thesis looking for the Socialist Workers' Party definition of socialism. I can't find it. It's illusory. It's hidden. I think it's hidden in the vaults of Paul Foot's house or something. But I don't know where it is. So, if somebody from the back can show it to me, I defy my opponent. This is a public debate. Show me where the Socialist Workers' Party defines socialism in the way that he says it does. I don't believe it. But let me simply point to a basic political contradiction. It shows my opponent to be putting forward the logic of somebody who's half-crazed. He says, first of all, we've got to smash the system, and then we've got to tell people about abolishing the wages system. That's what he just said. He said, look, we can't tell them about the wages system. There's more important work to do first. You smash the system. In other words, you're going to have the pregnancy after the birth. First of all, you have the revolution, then you tell people what it's in aid of. Don't be silly. Is there any wonder that workers don't take notice of this nonsensical Leninist dogma that a small group of people with hidden definitions of socialism, somewhere in the pamphlet at the back of the room, which he's not sure whether it even bloody exists, is going to tell us about socialism and they're going to lead us to it? It's nonsense.
Question at the back. Can we just take questions? I think people want to take questions. Any questions?
I don't see why we should restrict ourselves to questions at this stage.
Well, you're not chairing the
I've
meeting.
got a question. I suppose this meeting's about class war in terms of bosses and capitalists. But what I want to know is the position on another war, which is actually war, which is recently we were supposed to celebrate, which I took no joy in celebrating. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it was nothing. It was a non-event. But this is the real thing that workers have to come up against, and that is the possibility of going to war, fighting one another. So what's the SWP? Say, for argument's sake, over Falklands. What was the view of the SWP, and what was the view of the Socialist Party of Great Britain? It was something like Falklands, or all wars for that matter. What is their platform?
Yeah, basically, I mean, it's rooted in the capitalist system of production or in the state capitalist system of production. We say the state capitalist system of production because how do we account for the war between China and Vietnam, two supposedly socialist states, with one invading the other? How do we account for the rolling of Soviet tanks into Prague in 1967, into Hungary in 1956, and so on? The Soviet Union sending in military forces to a supposedly socialist ally. How do we account for the whole suppression of the Solidarity movement in Poland and the big stick which was wielded from Moscow by the Soviet Communist Party? So basically, I mean, I'm not sort of elaborating on it, but I mean rooted in the whole capitalist system of production where the priorities are, whether it's in Russia or Britain or America or Cuba, the profit motive and ripping off other people. Whether it's capitalists or state managers or state bureaucrats, doesn't matter. It's still exploitation. You've still got wage slavery, the point that you were bringing out.
Well, I'm very pleased. You see, you notice we're now moving my opponent into the direction of abstract propagandism.
No, not at all.
We're beginning to educate him in abstract propagandism. By the end of the evening, he'll be an abstract propagandist. He'll go out and talk sense to workers. And this is good, because he's quite right, of course. If somebody says, why are there wars? You answer quite simply. Capitalism, whether it's state capitalism or private capitalism, produces wars over trade routes, over territories, over markets, over exploitable populations, over natural resources. That's what all wars are about. But you see, my opponent's got a bit of a problem. Socialist Workers' Party's in a quandary here, because at the beginning, before he became an abstract propagandist, my opponent said, look, you've got to be where the workers are. You know, you start out from what the workers are thinking. If the workers are thinking something, you don't detach yourself from it. But what were the workers thinking at the time of the Falklands War? What were the workers thinking at the time of the First World War, when miners in Britain, after a wave of pre-war militancy, knuckled under, and in most of the coalfields of Britain, you had miners joining in productivity schemes to support the profits of the British war government. What were the workers doing during the Second World War, when miners were joining together to support the most conservative-based views on the grounds that this was capitalist democracy fighting against fascism. So you see, if my opponent has got to say that you've got to sort of tag on to anything that workers are doing in order to have credibility as a socialist, then he's got to support wars when workers support wars. And that is going to put him in a very awkward position. So what I would say is at wartime, and it's a very good point that you make, if there's a war tomorrow, there'll be immense pressure on workers to whip up nationalism, racism, whatever particular religious conflicts there might be, whatever divisions they can create, whatever bloody ideological crap they can fit into workers' heads, they'll use it in order to get workers to fight a war. But I put it to my opponent. If my opponent is going to say, well, look, we don't go in for abstract propagandism. When the workers are waving flags, we too must wave flags. When the workers are on the march, we must be on the march as well. Well, that's exactly the position of the Communist Party before the Second World War. When the Communist Party went on the march and actually said that workers should vote Conservative in areas where there were Conservative candidates standing, because after all, workers were in favour of the war, and therefore you vote for them. The Communist Party was actually issuing leaflets during the Second World War, when the miners of the Rhondda Valley wanted to go out on strike for higher wages during the war. The Communist Party said, what you've got to do is stop the strike for the sake of the war effort, because that's what the majority of workers are thinking. Now, of course, if you are what he calls an abstract propagandist and what I call a principled socialist, you don't simply accept whatever particular prejudices are dominant in the working class at any time. You do confront them. You don't go along with your sanity and your so-called relationship with the working class. You do have to not detach yourself from workers' experiences, not detach yourself from workers in the language you use and the propaganda you engage in, but you have to detach yourself from ideas which are anti-socialist ideas. That's a difference between opportunism and principle, and I think it's a distinction which is emerging clearly in this debate.
Is it a question?
I'd like to remind the Chairman.
Is it a question?
I'd like to remind the Chairman that this is a joint SPGB-SWP debate, and we in the SWP do not agree to restricting the debate from the floor.
There's no attempt to restrict the debate.
Which is dominated by the two speakers on the platform. We want everybody here to be given an opportunity to make contributions to ask questions. Now, not in half an hour when those speakers
that isn't democracy.
If people want to make a contribution, they should be entitled to do so. Why are you trying to restrict debate?
I'm not trying to restrict debate. You can make a contribution later on. What I'm trying to do at this moment is clarify points. So you can ask. There have been no contributions from Socialist Party members so far, so I don't see why you should start.
10. People will be leaving the meeting fairly soon.
Okay.
I want to make a contribution now.
Are you from the Guildford Anarchist Group, incidentally?
I'm from the Guildford Socialist Workers.
No, he thought you were.
With whom this meeting was organised.
Fire away.
I'd like to clarify one thing first of all. The Socialist Workers' Party has never argued that Russia was ever socialist, because we believe that socialism...
Because it has.
You've got to speak with
Let me speak.
He said they
Because we believe that socialism can't be built in one country. Socialism has to be built on a world scale. What actually happened in Russia in October of 1917 was that the working class took state power. And for a short time in Russia, for a few years, the workers actually ran that society. They didn't create socialism. They established a workers' state and attempted to spread the revolution and create a world revolution so that socialism could then be built. I think it needs to be clear that that is our position. But what I really want to talk about is the question how. That's the critical question. We can all sit here until the cows come home talking about how nice it would be to live under socialism. You can all agree about how nice socialism would be. That's not the point. The point is, how do we get there? Now, Steve in his comments said quite rightly that the emancipation of the working class, that is, the introduction of socialism, the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. Quite correct. So how do we persuade the majority of the working class to become socialists, to fight for revolution, to smash the state and establish a socialist society? How do we get there? That is the question any socialist meeting should be addressing itself towards. And the fact of the matter is that workers learn. Workers become socialists in struggle, fighting about what Steve Coleman at the beginning of the meeting described as the crumbs. Workers learn fighting about the crumbs of capitalism. Socialism is an idea that floats around in space, and one sunny day it finds its way into the heads of 25 million workers, and lo and behold, they wake up the next morning and inaugurate socialism. It's an idea floating around in the air. Socialism is the outcome of workers fighting in society now against capitalist exploitation, against all forms of oppression. It's out of the class struggle, according to Marx, that the working class comes to socialist consciousness and begins to fight for socialist change. I want to use as an example the miners' strike. You criticised us for having as our slogan during the miners' strike, stop pit closures. Absolutely correct that slogan was, because the simple fact of the matter was, it was not profitable for the bosses to keep all those pits open. There was a direct conflict of interest between workers fighting for their jobs, fighting for a living on the one hand, and the profit system on the other. The slogan, stop pit closures, was an anti-capitalist, an anti-profit, if you like, an anti-wage system slogan that mobilised 150,000 miners and their families on strike for a year. And in the course of that strike, not only did they learn that capitalism can't afford to keep their pits open, capitalism can't afford to provide them with a living, not only did they learn that, they also learned that the state is the enemy, that the police are the enemy, that the media is the enemy, that the judges are the enemy. So that by the end of that strike, the most militant pickets was some of the finest socialist workers anywhere in the world. Workers who hated the state, who wanted to smash the state, who would, if they'd been joined by millions of others, certainly have made a revolution. Finally, let me carry on by referring again to that book which the Socialist Workers' Party has just produced, The Great Strike. Because we in the Socialist Workers' Party fought for 12 months with the men and the women of the mining communities, because at every turn we were the best arguers against the police, the best arguers against the media, the best arguers against the Tories and so on, because for 12 months we stood with them on the picket lines against all of that shit, that book, The Great Strike, is now selling hundreds and hundreds of copies across the British coalfield. At Armthorpe Colliery, there's a letter in Socialist Worker this week. At Armthorpe Colliery, the SWP miners, and there are several SWP miners at Armthorpe Colliery now, they've all joined the Socialist Workers' Party because they're involved in the strike. The SWP miners took 15 copies of that book to their colliery. They sold out overnight. So they ordered another 40. They sold all 40 in one evening at the Miners' Welfare. So they ordered some more. And they have miners at Armthorpe Colliery coming up to them all the time.
Can you wind up your remarks? Because this is part of becoming a sort of lecture that you're giving and you're depriving other people of a chance to contribute.
They have miners coming up to them all the time asking for that book, so they keep copies in their hand. In other words, a book produced by the Socialist Workers' Party, the vilified, unpopular, lunatic left, is the best-selling book in that colliery. It is selling hundreds of copies to those miners and their families because we, as socialists, as revolutionaries, have established our credibility with that little working class community because we have related to their struggle over the last 12 months, and of course the Socialist Party of Great Britain played absolutely no part whatsoever in their strike. So I very much doubt that anybody at Armthorpe Colliery would be the slightest bit interested in a copy of the Socialist Standard.
Thank you for the brief comment.
And it's never going to be brief.
Obviously not.
Yeah. I wish I was at Tony Cliff's meeting next week, see if he extends
Come on,
me to
Steve, you can chair it.
Come on, you're not that short of members round here. Now look, I'd say this to you. I don't.
Good sense of humour.
I mean, that's it. Look, first of all, I see a major theoretical split developing here in the Guildford SWP. I don't know what profound national implications this is going to have, but the guy at the back says that they've said that socialism never existed in Russia. I say that they say it did exist until 1928. He says he's not sure whether it's 1929. He says he's not sure, but it definitely did exist, but he's not sure if it's 1919. But anyway, the point about it is...
Nothing is hard and fast and dogmatic. There's a debate going on.
Well, Lord, there's a debate going on.
These issues.
The fact of the matter...
Can we let speak?
The fact of the matter is...
I thought he was calling me sterile.
The fact of the matter is, I think it is indeed a sterile debate, because I think, in fact, that what you do is you don't look at what one particular theoretician says or another one says. I think any worker with any kind of understanding of what socialism really means, who looks at Russia between 1917 and 1921, let alone the years afterwards, would be foolish in the extreme to imagine that that was a socialist society. Now, the fact is, I've got documents here from the Socialist Workers' Party saying it is. I don't actually care particularly whether individual members of the SWP disagree with the position that's in their publications. That's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is, that's what your party says, and perhaps, you ought to try and tell them that it never did exist in Russia. I think you're quite right. And then you say, well, the real question is, how do you get to socialism? And you give one answer, and then you fail to say something else. You say, workers learn fighting over the crumbs. Well, look, I've got to put it to you this way. If by fighting over the crumbs, workers really learn that the real struggle is not for the crumbs, but for the bakery, then I have to put it to you this way. Workers have been fighting for the crumbs for a bloody long time. Workers have been fighting for the crumbs not just since the 1880s, but a long time longer than that. The class struggle has been going on for a long time, and I'm afraid this idea that somehow, out of this fight over the crumbs, without actually talking about socialism, without actually putting forward clear ideas, because you're not allowed to do that, because somehow this is frowned upon as being, it's caricatured in a rather ludicrous way that we sit around in rooms having nice ideas and socialism drops out of the sun and Christ knows what. No one's arguing that. What we're arguing, very simply, is that you don't actually change ideas except by putting ideas. Now, if you actually engage, for example, and incidentally, let me correct one thing, for Christ's sake, don't go in for this absurdly sectarian and laughable sort of game of point scoring about which party knocked off more policemen's hats during the miners' strike. I mean, don't be silly. Somebody like myself, I was involved in the miners' strike. I'm a trade unionist. I don't know which trade union you're a member of. I don't know which trade union he's a member of, and I'm not doubting your credentials as trade unionist. I'm a secretary of a trade union. I'm an active trade unionist. I was active as a trade unionist in doing my bit in supporting other trade unionists in strike. Not just the miners in Britain, but the miners in a very important strike in South Africa, where miners weren't just beaten up on the picket line, but were murdered on the picket line by police with guns. The miners in Poland, who are still incarcerated in prisons for daring to stand up against the state. So don't engage in this kind of infantile point scoring about nobody in one particular colliery wants to read the Socialist Standard, as if you'd done a survey of everyone there to know it. But let me put this point to you. The fact of the matter is, when you join the Socialist Party, you join a party which has got a set of principles. When you join the Socialist Workers' Party, you join a party that's got clearly stated arguments, a political position, and you either agree with it and join, or you disagree with it and you don't. Or maybe in the course of being a member, you've come to disagree with it, and then you leave. Now, you are a member of a Leninist organisation. That's all very well. My opponent saying, well, William Morris is the wallpaper designer. William Morris was a revolutionary socialist. He might as well say, well, Lenin, he was just some bloke in Russia living in the beginning of this century. The fact of the matter is, Lenin and Leninism is a political theory that you either accept or you reject. And the theory of Leninism is a very clear one. It is based upon the assumption that the workers have to be led to socialism. Now, you either accept that and you are a Leninist, or you check it out and you're not. And if you're a member of a Leninist organisation, the answer to the question, how do we get socialism, is the answer that Lenin gave and that I quoted And although he accused me of distortion, he's given me no evidence for it whatsoever, because it's a direct quotation, and there are many of them. What Lenin argued, and it's a perfectly plausible theory, just happens to be one that is historically contemptuous towards the working class, and it's also, I would say, one which is wrong, which is that you have to have a leadership because you can't wait for workers to understand socialism, you can't put socialist ideas to workers. What you have to do is lead workers into socialism, pretty well without them knowing for it. They're still fighting for the crumbs, and you win the bakery for them without them knowing it. And I put this question very simply, arising out of what you say, and perhaps my opponent will answer it. You say, look, the miners' strike is a good example. You say after the miners' strike, some of the finest socialists were made as a result of that strike. You say hundreds of copies of a book are being demanded by miners who want to read it. Well, let me put the question to you. In practical terms, how many more socialists are there now in Britain in 1985 than there were in Britain before the miners' strike started? How many active socialists are there? The fact of the matter, as you know and any other active member of the Socialist Workers' Party knows, is as a result of the defeat of the miners' strike, your own membership is falling. As a result of the defeat of the miners' strike, socialist worker sales are falling. If you read the article by Paul Foote in the current issue of Socialist Worker, he tells you that whereas he was addressing a rally of 2,000 people in Newcastle this time last year, this year there was a mood of despondency. Most of the people there were dispirited and lacking in enthusiasm. The fact of the matter is, what the miners' strike has done is by producing a sense of hope in workers for a victory within the wages system, it has, sadly, it's a historical tragedy. It has created a mood of despair and political cynicism amongst thousands and thousands of miners. And that is something, that is a reality we have to face today. That all over the country and all over the world, there are workers who we have to deal with on the basis of the fact that they're not socialists, on the basis of the fact that they do feel weak. They do feel that trade unions aren't going to get them enough. They do feel that the so-called reform and left parties aren't going to get them anywhere. And what we have to do is present them with an alternative. For the Socialist Workers' Party to come along and say the alternative is to repeat the same mistakes of 1887, the same mistakes of 1984, to advocate that no pit closures is an achievable aim within capitalism. It's simply going to lead to greater disillusion. That might be a hard message for you to swallow, but it's one which, when the history of the 1980s is looked at, and if you're a socialist, you should be looking at it while it's happening, not after the event, you'll see that's the period we're living through.
Including the first name.
Yeah, I mean, after all, there was a question asked about how many miners are there now socialists after a strike that was started and eventually failed. I mean, the fact remains that there are miners today who are far more politically aware, and certainly aware as regards socialism and towards an organised, the need for an organised working class, especially among where there was the tighter, smaller communities where the women were involved. There are miners' wives today who are politically aware and interested in socialist issues, where a few years ago they would be the women in the traditional model just telling their husbands to go back to work. So, I mean, a lot has come out of this miners' strike, no doubt about it. I mean, that can't be denied. I mean, I can't sit there and say exactly how many there were, you know, whether it's 50 or 30 or whatever, I don't know. But I mean, we do know that there are more people interested in politics generally, which has got to be a good advance from working class people who normally would not be interested. Right? And any advance in that direction of working class consciousness cannot be dismissed at all. And not only that, amongst them, the various people the various workers up and down the country that supported that strike in one way or another, they suddenly found themselves visiting other factories other than their own, other workers coming together and talking about the issues. I mean, you can't just brush that aside. And if you want to talk about like the other part you mentioned about working class generally, there's falling numbers in lectures, a reduced number of workers interested in socialism generally. I mean, that is part of the background of the general downturn in workers' participation before the miners' strike, and of course is resumed after the miners' strike. I mean, there was a whole backdrop of downturn in working class strike. The miners' strike just come right in the middle of it.
Okay, that's contribution. Question.
I'd like to first draw people's attention to the language of the Socialist Workers' Party. You talk about smashing the system, and I think most people agree that to smash something is an act of violence. Which brings me on to your strategy, where you seem to think that by not engaging in what you call abstract propaganda, but in merely stimulating workers into some form of action through industrial crises and so on, then you will arrive at some kind of smashing the system. Well, I think most people here realise that there was an industrial crisis in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and that workers were stimulated into taking action. And there wasn't much abstract propaganda around, as you call it. In other words, there was no clear socialist message. Workers then took up fascism, and I think what you are preaching will lead to fascism.
Just a German analogy. I mean, how many workers... Okay, I agree there was a switch in vote, but you've got to ask yourself, what are the reasons? Why did a number of ex-socialists vote for Hitler? Why did some ex-members of the German Communist Party vote for Hitler? Why did Hitler come to power in 1933? You're talking about abstract propagandism. I mean, one would have to look at the whole role of Stalinism and the control over the German Communist Party from Moscow. The whole argument, ludicrous argument, that Trotsky argued very much against, when the German Communist Party were told, instead of forming a united front with the German socialists, they were told to condemn the German socialists as social fascists. And Hitler rode that whole bloody thing, agreed on a working class vote. But this is a point that Steve brought up. I mean, absolutely ludicrous. We recognise, ever since Disraeli's time, ever since the formation of the modern Conservative Party in the 1880s, 3 million British workers, the Afghanites of every generation, have voted for the Tory Party. We recognise these sort of problems. We recognise probably the vast majority of British workers also are racists. But our argument is that people only change their reactionary ideas in struggle by getting involved in things, say, like the Anti-Nazi League. Movements, what we call consciousness raising. Okay, you're coming back to, you're arguing we're leading to a fascist society. You brought in the element...
The point you don't indulge in what you call abstract propaganda. You're not raising consciousness. You're really encouraging people to smash the system.
Yeah.
And have a revolution.
Yes.
What does smashing the system involve?
Just come on the first point. Our argument is that you don't make a revolution through sitting on your bloody arse and reading books.
Who says it is?
Well, that's the sort of argument that you're putting forward. You haven't related. Okay, you've agreed you're a trade unionist.
You mustn't caricature arguments, though. Come on, let's have a serious debate.
I've never seen you at a miners' support. I've never seen any of the members of the Guildford Socialist Party of Great Britain at a local miners' support meeting. In the labour rooms where we raised £7,000, regularly ran coaches and trips down to the mining valleys. Put up miners. Yes, you're saying this is irrelevant.
Just coming back. Can we take another question?
Well, the element of force and violence, I mean, I haven't dealt with, but I think it's incredibly important. Can you sum it up? You can do. Yes, okay.
This question goes on from your force and violence, and we've talked tonight, we've heard you both condemn wars because they're against capitalism and they're aggressive. Now, I want to know, when you get to your utopia of socialism, your way or your way, how are you going to handle aggression?
What sort of aggression? Personal aggression?
It's a very aggressive meeting.
The old man coming on a Friday night and beating up the missus.
All right, I'll put it from the
I think
female
that's
point
also
of view.
rooted in the capitalist system.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the aggression that you're going to have to charge up in people to achieve what you want. How are you going to say to people, now we're going to live in peace? Because you're raising aggression, and what are you going to do when you get there with that aggression?
Constant aggression. As we said earlier, a lot of violence and aggression, social violence, is rooted in the capitalist system. I can't really give you a sort of clear answer. Things could go wrong. No, sorry. Steve's put us forward as if we're frozen. You put us in a little frozen compartment. When he was quoting bloody Lenin as if it's the Bible and talking about the 1880s and William Morris. We recognise that ideas change, that a lot of Marx's ideas have got to be applied to the 1980s. Marx was writing before the invention of bloody telephones, before automation, before electricity, before the rise of multinational corporations. No, it relates to what you're saying. I'm not gazing into a crystal ball. Things could go wrong.
Okay.
But if wars and aggression and so on and violence are rooted in the capitalist system, putting it very simply, I think there is a lot of other personal violence, family violence, and aggression between men and women, between parents and children. If you're going to look at real-life situations. Yes, I'm not going to say, oh yes, everything, after the revolution, everything's going to be rosy. You use the word utopian. Everything's going to change.
Okay.
We hope it will. We don't know.
Well, I think it's actually a tremendously important question, in fact, because if socialism means anything, it's going to mean a change in the way people live, a change in lifestyles, and it's going to affect people. I don't like these ideas of socialism where the factories change and the minds change, but the people don't change. I think if socialism isn't going to be a different society to live in, then I'm not going to be working for socialism. And it's because it will be a different society to live in. And it's because it will be a society that I want to live in, as opposed to the kind of society we are living in, that I'm a socialist. That's quite simple. And I'll answer the point by making two statements. First of all, I'm in favour. I hope it's not now to say it too much, but I'm in favour of political aggression. I'll tell you why I'm in favour of political aggression. Because when you don't have political aggression, what you have are political sedatives. And when you have political sedatives, you end up with the Labour Party and the SDP and the Tory Party. I'm in favour of people being bold about their points of view. I'm in favour of people standing up and saying, I disagree with what you're saying. This is why I disagree. I'm in favour of people being energetic and vigorous about their politics, because we're not going to get socialism by people sitting around reading books. And I think that one of the things I'm most opposed to is the kind of nonsense we've had in this debate, where people aren't actually dealing with points. What we're getting are caricatures. I think what we want to actually deal with are the points that are being raised. I think I could answer your point about aggression by saying this. I regard myself as a scientific socialist. In other words, I look at causes. And I ask, what is the cause of aggression? And I say the cause of aggression are the kind of relationships we have in society today. And I ask, what kind of relationships are they? And I say, above all, they're possessive relationships. They're relationships based upon property. They're based upon, that's my child, that's my wife, that's my woman, my man, my country, my race, my God. And people are taught to think in terms of this kind of absurd possession, when in fact, cooperation means people working together. It means recognising that the benefit of everyone is, in fact, the benefit of the individual. That no person, I would argue, and this isn't a moral statement, it's a materialist statement. No person can go to bed tonight and say there are people dying in a world with food mountains because they're starving to death. That there are people who are dying of hypothermia, while at the same time We're closing down coal mines and cutting down electricity production. No one can do that without recognising those contradictions. And of course they make us angry, and that's why socialism is, at least in part, the politics of anger and indignation against a system that is oppressing us and pushing us down and presenting us with insecurity. And it's that insecurity that creates aggressive people. It's that insecurity that creates the people who are members of the working class who go and join the police force. It's that insecurity that creates the people who go and join the army. It's that insecurity that creates the parents who beat up their kids. It's that insecurity that creates the nurses in overcrowded hospitals who've been known to beat up geriatric patients of 80 or 90. Psychiatric patients. That's what capitalism is doing. That is the aggression. And as a scientific thinker, I say, when you eliminate a cause, you get rid of the symptoms. And when you get rid of a society of competition and establish a society of cooperation, a society of common ownership, where what belongs to me belongs to everyone else, where the world that I live in is inhabited by everyone else and owned and controlled by everyone else in common, we get rid of the need for aggression. We get rid of the need not only for wars on a mass scale, but the war that we're all involved in every day of the week to try and keep our job, families, pay the rent, pay off the mortgage. That is the insecurity of capitalism that breeds aggression. I agree with my opponent. Socialism isn't going to overnight transform us all into people who are going to walk around with happy, smiling faces, because I'll never have a bloody happy, smiling face all the day, whatever sort of society we live in. And incidentally, I think it would be a pretty boring society if everyone did walk around with happy, smiling faces, because the pubs are going to have to be shut at least 1 hour a week during a year in socialism, so a few of us are going to be miserable. But of course, there's going to have to be the elimination of the cause, get rid of competition and establish cooperation. But I cannot emphasise enough that is precisely the kind of politics that is dismissed as being abstract. I would argue that it's precisely the kind of politics that grabs the imaginations of workers. If we can go to workers and say, imagine a society where you don't have to think about money anymore because you've got free access to the goods and services of the world. Imagine a society where you never need to have another fear about a nuclear holocaust or a conventional one. Imagine a society where the threat of the dole queue is no longer there, where the monotony of wage slavery is no longer there, where the hateful relationships based upon money and wages and employers and employees are no longer there. I think that can grab more people into the socialist movement over the next year than 100 minor strikes which end in defeat. That's what I think, and I think we can show it. We can show it by the fact that the socialist movement is recruited from people who understand not simply that they want to fight to keep pits open, because I notice a lot of the people who are fighting to keep pits open aren't too anxious to go down the dirty, stinking pits where people have to waste their lives away. I notice a lot of the people who are fighting for conventional weapons and instead of nuclear weapons aren't too keen to have to go out into wars like the Falklands, which was one of these humane conventional wars. I would say that is a society and that is a proposition to put to workers that could grab hundreds of thousands of people into the socialist movement. And that is why we urge people to help us to do precisely that.
Well, there's a couple more questions lining up.
I wanted to say that what we've seen before us tonight I think is very, very important. Because I think what we've witnessed here tonight is a head-on collision between rhetoric on the one hand and analysis on the other hand. And I'd like to make one or two observations, if I may, illustrating this contrast. Now, the Socialist Workers' Party speaker said some time ago that the struggles, the fragmentary, incomplete, unsatisfactory struggles of workers in their day-to-day occupations must be our starting point, and he threw this at the other speaker. Well, I thought that was a bit unfair, because, I thought that the first speaker, Steve Coleman, had indeed taken those struggles as his starting point. He may not have taken them as his finishing point, but he certainly took them as his starting point. Now, if you both take these struggles as your starting point, which I think you both do, The question then becomes, having started with this raw material struggle, messy, fragmentary, incomplete struggle, what are you going to do with it? And you had this during the miners' strike. Now, I looked at the different responses of the two parties involved in that strike. During the miners' strike, you had the SPGB dishing out leaflets saying, perhaps incredibly to miners, abolish the wages system, get rid of capitalism. That's what I call analysis, because it was backed up by all of these arguments about capitalism can't do this and can't do that, and socialism could do this and could do that. Now, from the Socialist Workers' Party, you had leaflets which, may I say, were a bit more shallow. They simply said, win the strike, victory to the miners, keep the pits open. I am tempted to say that is rhetoric, and it's no substitute for analysis, even though it's very popular in a sense, because it's got a lot of emotion, vitality, perhaps even virility. Now, on a more personal note, secondly, the Socialist Workers' Party referred several times to the Anti-Nazi League, and he said that's the kind of thing. You set up, you initiate the Anti-Nazi League, and you win over these anti-racists. Well, my first political involvement some years ago was with the Anti-Nazi League, and I can tell you for a start that I got involved with that because I was an anti-racist. It didn't teach me a thing. I was an anti-racist. I wasn't sure what to do about it. So somebody comes along and says, oh, we're the anti-racist group. You have to join in our demonstration or march or gig, whatever it was. I didn't learn much from it. In fact, quite the opposite. Because when I went down to Victoria Park, where they had the Rock Against Racism gig in '77, well, I found a socialist worker being sold on the street in East London on the way to Victoria Park, which I'd never seen before. And quite frankly, it left me bewildered and confused and despondent and disillusioned and not quite sure what I was doing, because I thought I was just an anti-racist. Now there's all of this talk about the industrial struggle, which wasn't very clear and didn't really teach me very much about socialism. So in fact I had to sort of extricate myself from that and return to square one as a straightforward, simple anti-racist. So what I'm saying there is that the Trotskyist involvement in these campaigns does more harm than good. It actually takes people who are quite sincere, if naive, in their anti-racism and screws them up and fills them with all kinds of old-fashioned Leninist dogmas about the vanguard revolutionary party, which I quickly got away from. Now that's so much of strategy. If the chair will bear with me for a moment or two longer, let me move on quickly to the question of your aim. I think it would be unfair for the Socialist Party of Great Britain to accuse the SWP of not having set their aims. What the SWP have said their aim is for socialism is workers' councils, workers' control. Now, having made that concession, I must immediately say it's not a very precise definition, because if you've still got workers, you've still got that identity of being a worker, I'd argue that that implies you've perhaps got others who aren't workers. In other words, you've still got this lingering label that there are those who are workers in society and they are the ones who are in control. And indeed, the Socialist Workers' Party speaker said at one point, and I quote him because I've scribbled it down, if the ruling class had been defeated in the miners' strike, then that would have given more chance to other groups of workers in their struggles. Well, surely if the ruling class had been defeated, that would be it. There'd be more of those struggles. So you've got this kind of dual picture where you've got sort of semi-defeats and semi-victories the whole time.
Yeah,
now, I think, if I may just finish for a moment, I think in contrast to that, you had the Socialist Party saying, well, look, what the aim is to be is not for workers to improve their condition, but in fact, to get rid of their status as workers. The label itself is what's got to be abolished. Now, third and finally, having commented on strategy and on the aim, I'd like to comment on what I see as the most offensive point. You've obviously by now guessed where my allegiances tend to lay, but I'll say what I think is the most offensive point about Leninism as represented by the SWP, and that is the leadership aspect. And this is my final point, because you see, the SWP speaker said towards the end of his speech, the party must provide leadership. And he said that you're riding on the crest of the wave, and then, having done that, you must then start to get really stuck in and control and direct the movement. Well, I defy him to control my movements, if you'll excuse the expression, because, quite frankly, how could he seem to say whether I'm going to be one of the leaders or one of the followers in this process? I defy to be classified in that way, and I'm much more attracted, as I think a lot of people are, towards the alternative, what I would call the genuinely socialist conception. You have no leadership, you don't have a vanguard of professionals, which is what this lot set themselves up to be. Instead, you have a much more equal, equality-based system of analysis, not rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, he made so many bloody points. Some will come up in the summary. I mean, the last one, it seems to me, you see, that revolution is an incredibly authoritarian business. You know, to smash a modern industrial society, looking at the sort of weapons that the army and the police have got, is an incredibly difficult business. and just keep shouting about how are you going to do it? What is the strategy? Where is the party? Where is the coordination? Quite honestly, I think you want incredible discipline. No ruling class ever withdraws voluntarily from the stage of history. It's a tremendous struggle, a tremendous fight back. You know, how the hell are you going to do it with just words and rhetoric, no organisation, no party, no coordination, no leadership? You may well be right. I am not saying...
I didn't say no party or no coordination. I said no leadership.
Okay, well, how do you bring coordination about of all the local struggles? How did they make it? Okay, I know you people have written off the Russian Revolution, but how did they make it in October 1917? A revolution. Anyway, just summing up, okay, Steve's put the knife in. We presented a particular case. Someone once said, I believe, that the Socialist Party of Great Britain was not so much a movement as a monument. A monument to what? Either to possessing the only true vision of socialism, or a monument to a sectarian purity that prevents you from getting your hands dirty in the everyday struggles of ordinary folks. And the priority is what I've called, for the Socialist Party of Great Britain, and summing up, the priority seems to be what has been called, as we see it, rightly or wrongly, abstract propagandism. That is, the priority is putting over socialist ideas as a means of getting rid of capitalist, of bourgeois ideology. As a result, engagement in any struggles, engagement in any partial struggles, is regarded by the Socialist Party of Great Britain, it seems to me, as a waste of time until you've spread the word. Indeed, I think from what Steve said and other Socialist Party of Great Britain supporters or members or whatever from the floor have said, you seem to think that it's dangerous to engage in everyday struggles of ordinary people. Because you seem to believe that it somehow helps to reinforce workers' acceptance of capitalism and the whole division which reformists, which people, for example, in the Labour Party accept, the whole division between economics and politics. But we in the Socialist Workers' Party, I think, would argue for some kind of notion of transitional politics, of relating, as I mentioned earlier, of people like Rosa Luxemburg tried to relate, relating reform to revolution. For you, however, reform, it seems to me, reform seems to mean compromise as a kind of sop to the working class, thereby somehow delaying the socialist revolution a la the Socialist Party of Great Britain as they see it, their particular vision. Whereas we, I think, would argue, we would see the struggle for reforms in terms of their subjective effects on ordinary people's class consciousness. As a result, it seems to me that you don't really have any conception of building a movement through agitation over immediate demands that might eventually make the maximum programme of the classless, wageless, stateless society one day in the future a reality. Your activity, it seems to me, is confined to propaganda. That is, to enlightening the working class about the need for a socialist society. As a result, you don't seem to see any way of connecting the future with the present except through talking endlessly about the future. Struggle, ordinary everyday struggles as a kind of class educator seems to me, from what you've said tonight, to be almost totally ignored. In other words, our argument is, somehow, since you alone in the Socialist Party of Great Britain represent the true interests of the working class as you see it, all other parties, all other groups must somehow represent interests, including the Socialist Workers' Party, must somehow represent interests hostile and diametrically opposed to the working class. And this, of course, prevents you from doing any of the kind of united front work which our comrade over there brought up as something I've mentioned because I thought it was a brilliant success. Someone over here said it just led to a lot of people voting Tory and not for the National Front. I think the Anti-Nazi League did have a very, very important impact that has not yet been entirely documented. In other words, your perspective always prevents you from doing any united front work. Of course, finally, there are times, there are situations where all you can do is make propaganda. Of course there are. As, for example, in the post-war boom years. But even then, I think, we would argue you have to try and look for every opportunity to involve ourselves in whatever struggles, whatever fightbacks against the system, against the capitalist system are taking place. Can you really make a revolution by reading books and sitting around slagging off other revolutionaries? Our line, finally, is that socialists have to be ready to get their hands dirty and often to get their hands bloody filthy, to involve themselves in ordinary people's struggles, and if these battles are around limited demands which do not challenge the whole capitalist system, it's still a damn good thing that ordinary people, given the whole existence of capitalist society, the role of the media, the role of ideology, it's still a damn good thing that at least people get off their arses and are drawn into activity, are often drawn into action. And we argue that the masses' ideas, whether reformist or, as people have pointed out, even reactionary, and we've pointed it out, a hell of a lot of workers do beat their wives every Friday night, are racists, have voted consistently over the past 100 and 150 years for the Conservative Party. We argue that the masses' ideas, whether reformist or even reactionary, can only be changed in activity, can only be changed during the whole process of struggle and fight back against the system. So, summing it all up then, we are arguing that the best training for socialists is involvement in the everyday battle that most of us have, the everyday battle between labour and capital. And finally, the fact is, the assault on the workers, as the miners' strike so clearly shows, is a thoroughly political one. It is about getting your hands dirty and relating to ordinary folk, ordinary working people. Because, and I think Steve might agree with this, the tiny group of rich and powerful men, and maybe a handful of women, who control industry and property, are determined to defend their class superiority from any pressures, any incessant demands from the working class movement. The fact is, the ruling class have organised politically, through their representatives in the Tory party, to pick off each group of workers, isolate them, humiliate them, and break their spirit. Their struggle is not isolated in individual industries or factories. The fact is, and it comes back to a point which someone made in the audience, these people operate as a tightly knit group of politically motivated people, politically motivated men. Obviously, then, the response of workers, if it is ever to succeed, must also be political. And we've argued, and you've argued, this doesn't mean voting every 5 years for a Labour candidate. It means linking different struggles and pointing out the common enemy in each of those separate, localised, frequently localised struggles. It means binding the fight in Britain. Steve's brought this point up in the case of South Africa, South African miners. It means binding the fight in Britain with similar fights abroad. Only then, perhaps, will you begin to break through the crust, the often thin crust of modern capitalism, and create a society where the wealth which workers produce is used for them and not against them. And finally, anyone here tonight who wants to join us on the road to revolutionary socialism knows where to find us at the back of the room.
Well, first of all, let me say, for my chairman, colleagues and friends, I don't think that, in any sense, we should sort of look down upon debate. You know, I know that it's very easy to fall into easy metaphors about people sitting on their asses and so on, but, you know, workers don't get a lot of chance to sit on their asses. Let's enjoy it when we can and use our brains while we are sitting on our asses. And, you know, debate is important, because the political agenda in Britain and across the world, the political agenda is dominated by what goes on from Sir Robin Day and Sir Larry Lamb and all of these other sort of people who've been knighted for their political stupidity. And we've actually got to take that. We've got to take it away from the university professors, take it away from the media pundits, and get debates in pubs like this. So I think it's great. And incidentally, I think reading books is very important. I don't know why my opponent seems to have some objection to reading books. I think reading books is very important indeed. I read... Incidentally, he recommended that we read a book during his talk.
He sold out the back of the room.
What my opponent said is you won't get socialism by reading books, and then when asked to give an analysis of the miners' strike, he said, well, I can't go into it now, but read the book. But I would say reading books is important. We've got to do it, because an educated and intelligent and conscious working class is unstoppable. And I think we mustn't go in, and I think tempted to accuse my opponent of it, for the kind of politics of condescension, whereby there are these people called the working class who wear flat caps and walk around sort of looking for leaders to follow. And it's not like that. Workers are actually very powerful people. Workers run society from top to bottom. Workers actually form the trade unions. It's workers who actually print the newspapers. It's workers who actually organise the technology of society. There's not a hospital that would open tomorrow if workers didn't go in. So let's not be patronising about socialism. If we're going to get it, it's going to be by appealing to the intelligence and the consciousness of members of the working class. It's not going to be by engaging in some kind of metaphor of spontaneous revolution or some sort of assumption that capitalism is going to collapse around our ears. And my opponent, well, it was... a sort of a stab at wit, I suppose, where he says, we're not a movement, we're a monument. Well, you know, perhaps we are. Perhaps we're a monument to socialist principles. And you've got to, as my opponent says, we're living in hard times. The socialist movement is very small indeed. Let me say one thing, and I say it in case anyone is in any doubt. We're a couple of petty, insignificant organisations. The fact of the matter is, the movement for socialism, what goes on in capitalism, will be affected hardly at all by what goes on in this debate in Guildford tonight. It won't be reported on the front page of The Sun, you know, SWP can't agree about whether there was socialism in Russia. I think it should be in The Sun, incidentally, because I think it's an absurd position for a party to be in. But nevertheless, let's not kid ourselves. What we've got to do is get into the argument out there. The argument, perhaps, the people who aren't in this room but are in this pub. The argument about people in the workplaces. The argument where there are factories closing down, where there are coal mines, where there are people in communities who feel threatened in any ways. And also, of course, not only people who are in employment. We've got to appeal in our ideas to the young workers who haven't got a job and haven't perhaps got any chance of getting one. We've got to appeal to old workers, and of course there's an increasing number of old workers, which ought to be a marvellous thing for a society, but it's actually a problem for capitalism. Capitalism's got a problem of having too many workers who are being kept alive. We could appeal to the experience of those workers and get them into our movement. We can appeal to people who aren't in the workplace, the women, the disabled people, the people who in one way or another very often are kept out of the workplace. workplace. This is how we make our movement. It is an historical movement, and I think that to dismiss it as being a monument is more than unfair. And of course, my opponent says we must go out and involve ourselves in the class struggle. What does he think we do every day? What does he think we do? Does he think we go out and we don't involve ourselves in the class struggle? Do you think because you're a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, when you get into work and the boss says you're going to get less money, you're going to have to work more time, we sort of turn around and say, well, lucky for you, we're a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. We're not going to argue about this. You know, I'll tell you what, you want to have a talk to my opponent wants to have a talk to the people who employ me and find out whether I'm involved in the class struggle or not. We're involved in it, all right. So you've got no problem about that. And incidentally, no worker can avoid being involved in the class struggle. It's very hard not to. But the important point is this, that capitalism creates consciousness. And the most powerful weapon we've got, let's get rid of these old French revolutionary ideas and Russian revolutionary ideas, all of these capitalist revolutions of the past, that somehow revolutions are going to be carried through by bullets and armies. And I believe before the general strike, the Communist Party used to have weekend trips to Epping Forest where they used to train with guns, pretending, you know, they used to actually use tree branches pretending to be guns. And I don't know, I mean, let's forget this silly romanticism about insurrections and militias and we're going to set up a workers' state. And, you know, my opponent's getting a bit sinister as well. You know, revolution's an authoritarian business. I mean, he's got to be kidding. Stability's an authoritarian business. Capitalism's an authoritarian business. Socialist liberation is the end of the authoritarian business, because when you've got the power of a conscious working class, you get rid of that. And I put this to my opponent as well. You see, I put it arising out of what he says. Come the next election, he spoke about Harold Wilson. In 1974, Harold Wilson was elected as Prime Minister. I want to read you what it said in Socialist Worker, because it always amuses me. This was in Socialist Worker just before the 1974 general election. It says, every socialist, every worker must spend all the days before polling day shouting two simple slogans, at work, in the home, and whenever anyone will listen. Defend unions, vote Labour. Now that's a direct quote from them. Now, incidentally, you can imagine these bores going around, you know, every single moment of the day, in the work, at home, in the pub, vote Labour, defend the unions, vote Labour, defend the unions, you know, and they go along to Grunwick, vote Labour, defend the unions. That's funny. How come the Special Patrol Group, which the Labour government set up, which they told people to vote for, is out there smashing unions when they're trying to fight for recognition? Of course, it's nonsense. And the thing is, that by arguing this idea of the lesser evil, that you vote for one administration of capitalism rather than another, what they're doing is they're pandering to this quite incorrect myth, one put forward by the Labour Party, that Thatcher is the real enemy. And that, of course, is a position that they end up putting. Not that capitalism is the enemy, but that Thatcher is the enemy. And I have to show you, what they write. It amazed me. Look. This is the front page of Socialist Worker. Thatcher is the enemy. That's nonsense. It's nonsense. You know, this is pandering to the most infantile sort of political views. I mean, if Thatcher is the enemy, then, you know, why weren't the Socialist Workers' Party on the move before the IRA down at Brighton at the Grand Hotel? Blow her up. I mean, if she's the enemy, if that's the enemy, bang! Get rid of her. Of course she's not the enemy. Of course the Tories aren't the enemy. Of course...
Is she a friend?
Sorry?
Oh,
look,
is she the enemy or not? She can only be one or the other.
I tell you what she is.
She's not neutral, is she? That's for sure.
I tell you what she is. She's the tip on the iceberg of capitalism. And if Margaret Thatcher fell off tomorrow morning, your exploitation... Wait a second. I
thought you sort of agreed to this.
Wait a second, come on. I mean, give it a break. This isn't the Guildford Anarchist Group, as he said. You know, do you know what? A few more years of discipline and authoritarianism in the Socialist Workers' Party, and you won't be shouting out at me. But I'd say this. I mean, incidentally, I quite like people who shout out at meetings, because I normally shout out at meetings when I'm in the audience. But you've got to learn to be a Democrat. But I'd say this. This debate, and let me include on this, it's about which way forward for socialists. And the way forward for socialists, you know, I'm a simple person with a basically kind of logical mind. I try to think logically. And if you ask me which way forward for socialists, I assume you're talking about socialism. And then I have to say, what do you mean? What is it? What is this socialism that we're all going towards? Every time you mention socialism to my opponent, he sort of says, oh, you know, don't mention it. It's a bit embarrassing. You know, it's abstract propagandism. What we've got to do is get involved in the fight over the crumbs, the real struggle, you know, the immediate struggle. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in the real. I'm not interested in this real struggle. You know, reality's a big turn-off for anyone who's a revolutionary. Revolutionaries are interested in transcending reality, not burying themselves in this daft reality of capitalism where you march up and down saying ban cruise missiles and introduce conventional weapons and all of this nonsense that workers have been persuaded to do for years and years. The issue isn't to defend exploitation, to defend one form of bomb instead of another. The thing is to get rid of the system. And therefore, I would say that you only get socialism when you've got socialists. You only get socialists by putting ideas to people. You know, the human animal, contrary to things I read about in strange newspapers that come through my letterbox, we're not psychic beings, you know. I think the SWP might think we are psychic beings, and we all go on a picket line and have a psychic experience, and we come out understanding the lessons of Marxism. We don't. We've got to talk, we've got to argue, we've got to put ideas. We've got to say to workers, this is what we mean by socialism. This is where we're going. Because I put it to you again. When I go back to London tonight, I go into Guildford Station, and I say to the bloke, I want to get to London. And if I say to the man, all right, you want to get to London? Where is it? What do you mean by London? That's the only way we're going to know which way the train's going to go. If I go along and say, well, look, I don't want to engage in these sort of abstract discussions, just put me on the train. He'll say, all right. You can go to Dorking, you know, I came here through Christ knows where, Cobham, Chopham, Effingham, places I've never heard of in my life. I don't want to go that way again. I want to go in the direct route because I want to know where I'm going. So of course, we've got to be a party of no compromise. And if we're a party of no compromise, I'm not proud of getting my hands dirty. I'm not proud of getting my hands dirty. You get your hands dirty when you collaborate. You get your hands dirty when you engage in the dirty business of supporting... Listen, look, can I tell you something? I don't know whether you're some sort of romanticist or something. Class struggle's not a very dirty business. I should imagine. Look, let me tell you this. The class struggle, the average worker who comes home from work at the end of the day, the first thing he does, he has a wash. He puts on some decent clothing. It's actually only the bloody parlour room revolutionaries who dress up in the dirty clothes and walk around with their hands dirty and try and pretend to be tough people of the future people's militia. So cut it out. If we're really talking about socialism, what we're talking about is not something that's dirty. We're talking about peace. We're talking about cooperation. We're talking about mutual trust. We're talking about equality. We're talking about cooperating with other people. And I tell you what, I'll conclude with this if you have to. I'll conclude with this if you have to act like an anarchist. If you want to fight for socialism, if you want, as your party claims it wants, a conscious minority people's militia to fight for socialism, you're welcome to start tomorrow morning. Start out with the police force of Guildford. Start out with a territorial army, because if you want to talk about violence, and if you want to talk about smashing things, let me put it to you this way. At least as a so-called armchair socialist, I'm in the right place. As a bloody armchair soldier, you're in the wrong place.